So just to keep things rolling here, I'm just going to go over some of the research that's been supported by PSC partners and some of the research trends. And I think we've gone over a lot of this already today, so I think I can get through this relatively quickly. The first thing I want to point out is that there's a very important role that PSC Partners plays, not only in providing you all with support and information, but also supporting research in the academic community. And this has been going on for a number of years. And this just lists the number of awards that have been given throughout the years by PSC Partners to a number of different groups, both in the US and Europe, to further research efforts in this disease. And it's both clinical and basic research. It's a number of investigators, and this really gives the seed funds that allows for larger grants from federal and other funders. So this has just been really vital. And I think that you can see, and Ricky, you can correct me, I think it's up close to $3 million, if not over $3 million that's been awarded over the years. So a not insignificant impact on the research being done in this field. And so, from the researcher's point of view, we are incredibly grateful to the work that you all do, PSC Partners has done to support those efforts. This is a list of the most recent awards from this year, ranging from the very basic to even a clinical trial. So Dr. Alpini down in Texas, looking at extracellular vesicles. These are sort of recently described things found in your blood that are used in signaling and may have a potential for treatment. Dr. Assis at Yale is looking at these organoids, which are little collections of cells that function almost like a bile duct that we can study in the Petri dish. And the neat thing about that is that you can collect them and develop them from patients with PSC or other diseases. So during an ERCP or even an upper endoscopy, they can collect bile and grow these organoids in a culture and then test them to see what is there specifically about these cells from PSC patients compared to others. Dr. Bergquist is looking at, in Sweden, doing a clinical trial using a common drug called atorvastatin for the treatment of PSC, and that's going to be in a randomized controlled trial, so a well-designed study. Dr. Chow is looking at microRNAs. These are also sort of new and cutting-edge molecules that regulate gene expression, and specifically looking at liver fibrosis in PSC. Dr. Gula Hassim is at Toronto, and we'll be looking at clinical and immunologic changes in patients with recurrent PSC, so focusing on those patients after liver transplantation and trying to better understand what's going on clinically and immunologically in these patients that develop recurrent PSC. Chantal is in Paris, and she's looking at vitamin D and potential use of that and related molecules to treat PSC. Dr. Liu, another young investigator, is looking at a type of immune cells called T regulatory cells in PSC. And may have potentials for therapy down the road. She'll be looking in an animal model, so again, a basic investigation. And Dr. Strasabosko was awarded an additional year of funding for a study he was funded 2 years ago to look at the biliary epithelial cells, or the bile duct cells, and their immune response. Dr. Tabibian had talked about this molecule called LPS that can come from bacteria in the gut. And what they can do is they can stimulate these bile duct cells and their immune response. And again, he'll be using sort of the same organoid and other technologies to study that. So lots of really, I think, cutting edge, interesting research being funded this year, both in the clinical side as well as the basic science side. I just also want to point out that the interest in PSC and these diseases is beyond just this group here in the patient side of things. Dr. Strasabosko and myself chaired a emerging trends topic with our U.S. Society of Hepatology called AASLD, and the title was on Cholangiopathies, the Dawn of Curative Treatment. So pretty provocative title, I think. I can't take credit for it. That was Dr. Strasabosko. But it really focused on PSC and other diseases, but really PSC was an important part of that conference. So just really briefly to go over some of the work that's being done, I think some of the things we should think about is how we get to a cure, what we seek. And we have to understand the disease, identify targets for therapies, test whether they're safe and effective in cells or animal systems, and then prove their effectiveness in patients. And the only way to do that is with research. And the first three steps of that is really with basic research. And this is probably going to go on a little bit too long, so I'll try to go through it relatively quickly. But if we think about understanding PSC, and I borrowed this from Tom Carlson, we have sort of factors that lead to initiation of PSC, and these are genetic environmental factors. Then there are perturbations of the gut-liver axis that Dr. Tabibian was talking about earlier, including the microbiome and responses of immune cells that then may go and activate the cholangiocytes or bile duct cells. There are also components in the bile itself, the bile acids, that can be toxic and cause injury. This can set up chronic inflammation that involves cells like macrophages. And then finally, there's fibrosis, the scarring. This is the thing that's most important clinically because this is what is sort of the common final pathway to liver injury and leading to the final complications of cirrhosis. And so over the years, over the past decade, we've done a lot to sort of elucidate what are the genes that are involved in PSC and developing it. And we've identified at least 19 genes that are clearly identified in predisposing people to PSC. A lot of them are shared with IBD and other autoimmune diseases. But it's important to recognize that these are genes that cause PSC. This doesn't mean these are genes that are going to predict whether someone's going to do worse or necessarily lead to a treatment of PSC. They only tell us what was the underlying cause. And so far, there's only one gene that has been identified that's linked to disease progression. Environmental factors, they largely remain unknown. But again, these are things that may lead to the development of PSC. And Dr. Medici talked earlier about coffee consumption as being an environmental factor. We know smoking is also preventative. But again, once you've got the disease, it doesn't help to know that that's what caused it or might have been one of the factors causing it. Another thing I want to point out is some work we've done in the North America Consortium looking at PSC among African Americans. And this is an understudied area, but we do know that PSC occurs in African Americans. We've looked at transplant data and others, but this was from over 2,000 patients in, I believe, 11 centers, looking at the prevalence of PSC among their patients from these centers. And what we found was that if you look at most centers, the percentage of PSC patients that are African American is similar to the percentage of the black population that community, that center serves. So we really believe that the prevalence of PSC among African Americans is very similar to that among Caucasians. And this is important because when we look at sort of the genetic factors and other risk factors and the treatments, they may vary a little bit between different ethnic groups and racial groups. So I think it's important to remember that there's diversity among our patients as well. In terms of the gut-liver axis, I think we went over that in a lot of detail and how complex that interaction is. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but this was a study that was partially funded by the PSC partners, and it was from Norway, showing that, again, there are differences between PSC, ulcerative colitis, and healthy control. So there are 85 PSC patients in this study, over 200 with ulcerative colitis and almost 200 healthy controls. And the green and the blue bars represent ulcerative colitis and PSC respectively compared to healthy controls. So if you're on the left side here, you have fewer of these types of bacteria compared to healthy controls. If you're on the right side, you have more. And there's one genus here that was found to be PSC specific, although I have to say it's also increased in advanced liver disease. So how much that means is not clear. So still a lot to go here, but again, important work done and supported by PSC partners. Bile acids is a big area of interest and research, and especially because we really understand bile acid and bile physiology and biology quite well. We have lots of drugs that are available to target that, and there's really a lot of interest in using combination therapies. And this is just a schematic to show that this is the process and sort of the pathways in which bile acids are produced and excreted and then recirculated from the intestine back to the liver. And these arrows represent places where we can interrupt or interfere with these pathways. And so there's lots of opportunities for therapies here now. In terms of chronic inflammation, this came out during our conference, that Emerging Trends conference, and one of the questions is, why hasn't immunomodulation worked in PSC? This is supposed to be an autoimmune condition. Why can't we use drugs that are used for inflammatory bowel disease or other autoimmune conditions to treat this condition? And some of the thoughts in this is that we may be targeting the wrong place. We may have the wrong target, and some targets that are being discussed with, I think considerable interest is maybe IL-17. This is a cytokine that's very prominent in the liver of patients with cholestatic liver disease, and particularly PSC. And then also targeting macrophages, which kind of lie at this intersection between both this chronic inflammation as well as fibrosis. Maybe we're at the wrong place, and getting to the inflammation within the liver tissue where the inflammation of PSC occurs may be difficult. It's very fibrotic, and there may not be much blood flow there. And we may be treating it at the wrong time. We talked about that a little bit earlier today, as it may be, certain drugs will work at an earlier stage versus a later stage. So still clearly a lot of work to be done there. However, I do want to point out that the use of a drug that targets macrophages is somewhat interesting and promising. This is a drug called CVC, and this is work, again, supported by PSC partners done at the Mayo Clinic, in which an animal model, mouse model of PSC was treated with this drug CVC, and when they look at the amount of bile duct injury and fibrosis, again shown here, it's much reduced when we treat with this drug that blocks macrophages, these immune cells entering the liver. And this has already been in a clinical trial, and it's complete, and we're waiting results. It's been shown to be effective in reducing fibrosis in fatty liver disease, and hopefully, if it's positive in terms of the PSC study, that company will be interested in doing further study within PSC, but I think Dr. Hamid will probably talk about that some more. In terms of fibrosis, again, the role of macrophages I think is important. And then there's another target we have, alpha V beta 6, which is increased in PSC and other forms of fibrosis, blocking it prevents fibrosis in a PSC animal model, and so there's opportunities to target that as well. So I think we've got, and then again, just focusing on the bile duct cells themselves, there's quite a bit of interest in sort of other interactions going on there and potential targets, but still much more to learn in terms of this sort of very specific environment of particularly the large bile ducts. And again, this is just some data from Dr. Strasabosco talking about the immune responses, and I think what's interesting about this is that they not only can develop these organoids from bile collection, but also from what are called induced pluripotent stem cells. So when you see iPSC, it's not PSC with you guys, it's pluripotent stem cells, but basically they can take these cells from blood and develop them into these bile duct cells that then could be studied in the test tube, in the Petri dish. So if we look at, sort of what's available out there now, there's a number of targets we have based on our understanding of PSC to go after. The question is, how do we translate all this stuff into affecting what we're really caring about, which is, the clinical outcomes, the cirrhosis and complications of it, the cholangiocarcinoma and the cholangitis. And so that's where clinical research really comes into play. And I think one of the nice things that came out of our conference, and Ricky, gave a really excellent talk there to present sort of the patient's experience and what your needs are, and that was to focus on all patients, and that's hard to do in clinical research because we like to really cut and dice and just look at very specific patients, but I think having your input there was very important. Another important issue is how do we get a pathway to approval for new drugs. So any new drug has to go through FDA approval processes, and this is particularly challenging because, as we were talking about earlier, biomarkers such as alkaline phosphatase are not sufficient to get FDA approval, nor should they be enough to make us feel confident that a drug is going to work. There's a lot of work going on, patient-reported outcomes. These are basically tools that we use to quantify how a patient is feeling, whether that be itching, fatigue, and we're developing new, what are called PROs that are specific to PSC. There are issues around clinical trial design and increasing patient participation, which is quite difficult in rare diseases where everyone lives very far away. People are busy with their work life and family life. How can we do clinical trials that don't require patients to travel long distances and inconvenience them? How can we do virtual visits, et cetera, to increase patient participation? There are also drugs that are currently approved for other indications, such as vancomycin and urso. How do we get those drugs to at least acceptance? That is, they're available, but how do we get to a point where we feel comfortable accepting them as proven therapies? And then there's application of those things. How can we make sure that the things we already think we should be doing for PSC patients, that is monitoring their liver tests, screening for cholangiocarcinoma, screening for colon cancer, how do we make sure that that's being done in the clinic at a high rate and people are getting quality care? I'm going to skip over some of this and just point out that we have recently published some data from the PSC Partners Patient Registry. It's well over 1,000 patients in there. I don't know if Rachel's here and can give us the latest number. 1,000? 1,012.20. No one signed up this morning yet? You haven't checked yet? No? Okay. So we're at well over 1,000 patients now, but if you look at the patients involved in this, and I think this is really important because if you talk to people in the academic community, oftentimes they're skeptical about patients reporting, their medical condition, et cetera, et cetera. But if we look at the patients in this cohort, they essentially replicate any other PSC population that's looked at. If you look at the Mayo, the Norway, the UK, it's exactly the same in terms of the age of diagnosis, the percent with IBD. The one difference is the predominance of females in this database. The guys don't like to do online surveys. So, guys, step up. The good news is that the median transplant-free survival among this group was 21 years, which I think is really, really good to see. Also important in this sort of realm is some work that's been done by Mark Deneau and has been supported by PSC Partners. And this is a really amazing project. Mark has done an amazing job with this, pulling together pediatric cases from throughout the world, 780 patients, median age of diagnosis 12 years. The characteristics are shown here. And similarly in their group, small duct PSC did better than large duct. They found that IBD patients actually did better than those with no IBD. So a little different than we've seen in adults. But this is really interesting. I think this is continuing to grow. So I think, there's a very strong interest in PSC in children. I know that there's what's called the Children Network, which is a group of NIH-funded investigators looking at cholestatic liver diseases in children, and they're going to start focusing on PSC as well. So I think for the pediatric group, there's a lot of resources being brought to bear on this issue. This has already been shown. I won't speak much about this, and this is an international PSC study group that brought together 7,000 patients. The database is up to 10,000 now, and so it's much larger, and it's continuing to be mined for more information and data. This again is just some data that was supported by PSC Partners looking for new biomarkers. So these data are from Europe, looking at different markers and determining outcomes and looking at markers of fibrosis and trying to identify the ones that might be most valuable in terms of identifying responses to therapy in the future. And I'll skip that one. And then just to finish up, some of the work that's being done to try to advance this is getting more and more patient data, more detailed data into some registries. We've had a number of efforts going on and trying to coordinate them between North America and Europe. So in Europe, there's the International PSC Registry, starting in the Netherlands, which will include Oslo, Finland, and Sweden. This is sort of their setup. And then in North America, we have our Consortium Autoimmune Liver Disease. And currently we have about 20 sites in the process of getting started up. Currently we have about 6 or 7 starting up and entering data now. But this will be a very time and labor-intensive effort just to collect all the data. So this is sort of where we're at, and I think that we've, had a lot of important research being done in the last 10 years and continues to improve, and hopefully we can overcome these barriers we have so far and really get to a treatment that's effective, that we know who to use it in, and can alter the course of this disease. But it requires patients to participate. The funding from PSC Partners has been instrumental in our progress, and look forward to more in the future. Thank you very much.